On August 23, 2016, 18-year-olds Noah Cooper and Ethan Wilson disappeared without a trace in the Grand Canyon. For 4 years, their families mourned their empty graves until one of their friends suddenly appeared on the side of an empty highway. Ethan Wilson's return was supposed to be a miracle, but it brought with it a chilling truth. What the detectives discovered while checking the survivors' testimony destroyed everything they had believed before. What really happened in the depths of the canyon and why the return that the family prayed for was the beginning of an even worse nightmare. You will find out in this video. Enjoy the video. Some names and details in this story have been changed for anonymity and confidentiality. Not all photographs are from the actual scene. On August 23, 2016, 18-year-old Noah Cooper was in a state of elation that happens only once in a lifetime, on the verge of complete freedom. He had just graduated from high school in a small town in Arizona and was already preparing his documents for college, where he planned to study architecture. His friends and teachers remembered Noah as an energetic, athletic young man who never sat still. The trip to the Grand Canyon was not just a walk, but a traditional ritual before the beginning of adulthood. His longtime friend Ethan Wilson, with whom he had been friends since elementary school, went along with him. For both families, this hike seemed like a safe and familiar end to their summer vacation. According to CCTV footage from the entrance to the national park, the friends' white sedan crossed the border at 6:45 in the morning. The footage showed 2 smiling teenagers having a brief conversation with a ranger at the ticket counter. Noah, who was sitting in the passenger seat, waved at the camera. This was the last documentary evidence that the boys were alive and in good spirits. They were planning to take one of the popular routes designed for a day and return by the next evening. The alarm sounded on August 24th when both boys' phones went dead and they did not show up for dinner at the Cooper home by the appointed time. Noah's father, concerned about the lack of communication, arrived at the park late in the afternoon and found his son's car in the parking lot at the beginning of the Bright Angel Trail. The car was locked, and inside, through the glass, he could see half-drunk water bottles and a map of the route laid out on the back seat. Within an hour, the National Park Service announced the start of a search and rescue operation. The next day, on August 25, 2016, 60 volunteers and 2 helicopters began combing the area. Temperatures in the shade rose to 98 degrees Fahrenheit, and the hot stones of the canyon created an oven-like effect. Rescuer Thomas Gill, who participated in the operation, later recalled in a report that the search was hampered by unstable ground and numerous unmarked rock outcroppings. For the first 48 hours, the searchers found no trace of the boys, no footprints, no food, no abandoned equipment. It seemed that the teenagers had simply disappeared into the red dust of the canyon. The turning point came on the 4th day of the investigation. The search team, moving along a remote area near a steep cliff 3 miles from the main trail, noticed a foreign object. A piece of blue nylon fabric was caught on a sharp rock ledge overhanging a deep chasm. Noah's mother later identified this material as part of the backpack he had been hiking with. However, the most eerie discovery awaited the rescuers on a narrow ledge 15 feet below the cliff edge. There was a broken sunglass with a characteristic crack on the left lens. This thing became a symbol of the tragedy, a silent witness to what happened in the last seconds. Based on the position of the found items and the condition of the soil near the cliff edge, the investigative team, led by Detective Miller, put forward the main version of events accident reconstruction experts have suggested that a so-called chain fall occurred. According to this theory, one of the young men came too close to the edge to take a photo or get a better view of the landscape. His friend, hearing the scream or seeing the fall, rushed to help, trying to grab his friend's hand or clothes, but as a result, he lost his balance and was also pulled into the abyss by his own weight and inertia. This version seemed to be the only logical one because in that area of the canyon, the slopes were too steep and the stones underfoot turned into a moving mass at the slightest pressure. despite the fact that the rescuers tried several times to go deeper into the gorge where the bodies had probably fallen. The complex geometry of the rocks and constant collapses made it impossible. The operation was officially shut down 2 weeks after the boys disappeared. In September 2016, Noah Cooper and Ethan Wilson were declared dead as a result of an accident. For the whole world, this story became another warning about the dangers of wildlife. The families erected a symbolic memorial at the trailhead, confident that their children were forever there in the invisible depths of the canyon. However, they had no idea that 4 years later, one of them would return to destroy this official picture of the tragedy. On August 20th, 2020, at 18 hours 42 minutes, truck driver Mark Evans was driving along Highway 64, which runs along the southern edge of the forest. The sun was beginning to slope toward the horizon, creating long shadows from the pines, when Evans noticed a strange figure on the side of the road. The man was moving erratically, occasionally stopping and leaning against the roadside guardrail. According to the driver's statement to police, the man looked like he had just survived a severe accident or a long wander in the wilderness. He was wearing dirty, torn jeans and a gray t-shirt that had once been several sizes too large and now hung on his emaciated body. When Evans stopped the car and got out to help, the man looked up. His face was covered in a layer of dust, a thick, unkempt beard, and numerous fresh bruises around his eyes and on his cheekbones. The stranger was barely standing, his breathing was raspy, and his eyes were glassy and disoriented. When asked for help, he responded in a barely audible whisper, giving a name that made the experienced driver freeze in his tracks. It was Ethan Wilson, the man whose picture had been on wanted bulletin boards across Arizona for 4 years. The man who had been officially dead since September 2016 stood before him alive. 35 minutes later, the first patrol cars and an ambulance arrived at the scene. The area around the highway was immediately cordoned off, and Ethan was taken to a medical center under heavy guard. The appearance of the ghost from the canyon, as he was immediately dubbed by local journalists, became a real sensation. The phone at the sheriff's office was ringing off the hook. Journalists, volunteers, and concerned citizens were demanding confirmation of the information. However, the real shock came later, when Ethan, having received first aid, began to give a preliminary statement to Detective Miller, the same investigator who had closed the accident case 4 years earlier. According to the protocol of the first interview, Ethan Wilson stated that the double fall theory was wrong from the very beginning. His story was radically different from what investigators reconstructed in 2016. Ethan claimed that on August 23, 2016, at approximately 14 o'clock, while crossing a remote area near the old quarry, a conflict occurred between him and Noah Cooper. According to the survivor, the reason was a trifle, a discussion of future studies which unexpectedly escalated into an outburst of uncontrollable aggression on Noah's part. Ethan described his friend as a man whose psyche suddenly malfunctioned. He allegedly attacked him from behind, striking him on the head with a heavy object. According to Ethan, the subsequent events resembled a thriller scenario. He said that Noah did not fall into the abyss, but rather methodically planned the staging of their joint deaths. While Ethan was in a semi-conscious state due to a head injury, Noah allegedly pulled him away from the edge of the cliff, leaving his broken glasses and a piece of cloth there to lead the investigation astray. After that, Noah forced his friend to an abandoned maintenance building, a concrete well hidden deep in the woods, off the main tourist routes. Ethan claimed to have spent 4 long years in this dungeon, completely isolated from the outside world. The survivor's story contained details that made experienced detectives feel unrealistic. Ethan described the concrete walls of his prison, a rusty bed, and a single ventilation slot through which he could only see the change of day and night. He stated that Noah Cooper had been leading a double life all these years. He did not die in the canyon, but secretly lived somewhere nearby, appearing in the bunker every day to bring minimal food and continue psychological torture. According to Ethan, Noah enjoyed his power, constantly repeating that for the whole world they were both dead and no one would ever come to help. This testimony led the state police to immediately overturn Noah Cooper's death, ruling and open a new criminal case. Number 8814 Noah, who had been mourned as a victim for 4 years, was now officially the prime suspect in the kidnapping and unlawful detention of a person. An APB was sent out to all police departments within an hour. Noah's relatives were in a state of deep psychological collapse. They could not believe that their son was capable of such cruelty and skillful hoax. Noah's mother, Carol Cooper, in a brief statement to the press through her lawyer, only noted that the news breaks her heart for the second time. Meanwhile, a detailed medical examination began. Dr. Elliot Harris, a leading forensic scientist, was to confirm or refute Ethan's claims with physical evidence. The patient was extremely emaciated. He weighed only 122 pounds, which was critically low for a young man of his height. The wrists and knuckles showed old scars that could indicate prolonged exposure to shackles or ropes. Numerous bruises on his face and hands looked like the consequences of a recent struggle, which supported Ethan's version that he was able to escape only after another fight with his captor. While experts were taking blood tests and recording every injury on the boy's body, a group of special forces was preparing to enter the area of the abandoned quarry. The description of the concrete captivity provided by Ethan was quite accurate, and the police hoped to find there not only evidence of the survivor's presence, but also the monster himself. The entire state held its breath, waiting for the results of the search of the territory. The story, which for 4 years was considered a closed tragedy of two friends, was turning into one of the most mysterious crime dramas in modern Arizona history. Every fact, every detail that Ethan Wilson voiced was carefully checked because the investigators realized if he was telling the truth, there was still a dangerous criminal hiding in the forests around the canyon who knew every inch of this wilderness. However, Dr. Harris, studying the results of the first tests in his laboratory, began to notice things that made him put down his instruments for a minute and reread Ethan's testimony. Once again, something about the physiological state of the rescued boy did not quite match the horrific story of 4 years of imprisonment in a dark concrete bag underground. On August 21, 2020, an atmosphere reigned in the isolated room number 412 of the Flagstaff Medical Center that one of those present later called chilling from the grave. Ethan Wilson, whose sudden return became the top story in Arizona, began to give his first official testimony. Detective Miller, who led the investigation, set up a voice recorder on the metal bedside table and prepared a notebook. Now every word he said became a legal document in a case that in a matter of hours changed its official classification from search for missing persons to kidnapping, unlawful detention, and torture. Ethan spoke in a steady, almost monotone voice, which impressed the investigators most of all. He did not cry or show any signs of hysteria typical of people who have just escaped from years of captivity. His eyes were directed into the void in front of him, and the story of the events of August 2016 was striking in its eerie detail. According to the survivor, the attack took place in a remote area near an abandoned limestone quarry. When the sun was at its zenith, Ethan claimed that Noah Cooper acted in cold blood, and with calculation, the first blow to the head was inflicted by a heavy stone, which Noah had wrapped in a cloth in advance to avoid leaving direct biological traces on the instrument of crime. While Ethan tried to get up and orient himself in space, his friend continued to strike until the young man lost consciousness. According to the interrogation report, Ethan described the 4 years of his life as pitch black in an 8 by 10 foot concrete room. He stated that Noah had prepared the place in advance, which once served as a technical hub for quarry maintenance and had long since been erased from all modern maps. A rusty iron bed and a primitive ventilation system were installed. There, Ethan said, Noah Cooper had led a masterful double life all these years. For the outside world, he remained a tragically dead guy, but in reality, he appeared in the bunker almost every day. He brought minimal supplies of water and food and spent hours talking to the prisoner, methodically convincing him that no one would ever come to his aid. This ghost from the past, according to Ethan's legend, became his only connection to reality, turning into both an executioner and his only source of survival. However, while the detectives at the operations center were mapping potential locations for the bunker in an adjacent part of the hospital, Dr. Elliot Harris was completing an initial medical examination. His report, consisting of 12 pages of technical data and analysis, contained a number of facts that categorically did not fit the story of years of underground imprisonment. The first critical point was the physical condition of the muscles. Dr. Harris noted in the report that a person who stays for years in a confined space of several feet with minimal physical activity inevitably suffers from profound muscle atrophy. However, Ethan's legs and back were in healthy tone, which is usually characteristic of people who regularly walk long distances. The second factor that raised serious doubts was the blood test for vitamin D. Ethan insisted that he had seen sunlight only through a narrow slit for 1,460 days. Under such conditions, the level of vitamin D in his blood should have been catastrophically low, which would have inevitably led to softening of bone tissue and serious problems with the immune system. However, Ethan's readings were within the normal range for a healthy person who regularly stays outdoors. This was physiologically impossible for a prisoner of a gloomy concrete cellar. The third question concerned the nature of the injuries on the body. The bruises on his face and hands, which the truck driver was the first to notice, were fresh according to the results of the examination. They were no more than 48 hours old. At the same time, Ethan's wrists and ankles showed no signs of chronic violence, old chain scars, or signs of the prolonged torture he had described in such detail to Detective Miller. His skin did not have the characteristic pallor that appears after prolonged exposure to ultraviolet light. On the contrary, traces of a light tan were observed on his shoulders. Despite these obvious medical inconsistencies, the state police could not ignore the direct accusations. For them, Noah Cooper instantly turned into a major threat. Based on Ethan's detailed descriptions, a new manhunt was formed. Noah Cooper was put on the wanted list as a particularly dangerous criminal. The investigation theorized that Noah could have lived for years in the forests around the canyon, using his survival skills to remain invisible to rangers and casual tourists. On August 22, 2020, at exactly 5 o'clock in the morning, a group of special forces in 3 SUVs drove to the area of the abandoned quarry specified by Ethan. They were expecting to meet an armed maniac who had been deceiving the justice system and his own family for 4 years. The investigation was preparing to storm the secret lair, believing that Noah Cooper was somewhere nearby and might be watching them through the dense thickets of the Kaibab forest, protecting his concrete fortress and the terrible truth it hid. However, what they discovered behind the rusty door of the technical well made even experienced forensic scientists look differently at every word spoken by the surviving boy in the hospital room. On August 22, 2020, at 5:45 in the morning, 3 police SUVs stopped at the edge of the woods where any roadway ended, began the hike to the area of the abandoned limestone quarry. The terrain described by Ethan Wilson was extremely difficult to access, even for experienced rangers. Dense undergrowth of thorny brush, deep ravines washed out by seasonal downpours, and the complete absence of any marked trails made this sector of the Kaibab forest virtually isolated from the outside world. For 3 hours, the unit moved through the thicket, guided by the detailed coordinates provided by the surviving young man during the night interrogation. At about 9 o'clock in the morning, under a massive slope overgrown with old pine trees and littered with dead tree trunks, they found what they were looking for. The object was almost invisible from a distance of a few feet, an old concrete service well that had once served as a hub for maintaining the quarry's underground utilities. Its heavy metal lid was half covered with earth and camouflaged by dry branches. When the officers managed to pry the rusted manhole open, a heavy, stagnant odor of damp concrete, metal, and mold wafted from the opening. Detective Miller was the first to climb down, keeping his partner as backup. Inside the room, there was an oppressive, absolute silence. The beams of powerful flashlights snatched out of the darkness a scenery that matched Ethan Wilson's story to the inch. In the center of the small chamber stood a rusty iron bed, its legs crudely bolted to the concrete floor with construction bolts. Scraps of thick nylon ropes with distinctive knots still hung from the bed frame. In the corner, near an improvised plumbing unit, was a small pile of garbage, empty cans of cheap canned food, scraps of 4-year-old newspapers, and plastic water bottles. But the most important discovery was found under a layer of dirt in the far corner of the room. There was an old blue windbreaker with the logo of a sports brand. Noah Cooper's parents, who were later shown a photograph of the discovery, were horrified to recognize it as the same jacket their son had worn on a hike on August 23, 2016. The police immediately declared the area an active crime zone, cordoning off the forest within a 3-mile radius. The detectives expected to find traces of the kidnappers' active presence, fresh shoe prints outside, the remains of a campfire, or Noah Cooper's observation post. However, the very first results of the forensic work on the spot confused the investigation, sowing seeds of serious doubt in the survivor's version. Forensic scientist Sarah Wong, who spent 6 hours examining every square inch of the bunker, noted the abnormal absence of biological traces of the suspect. Not a single hair, fresh fingerprint, or epithelial particle was found in the room where Ethan said Noah had been every day for 4 years that could be attributed to Noah Cooper. All traces of vital activity found belonged exclusively to Ethan Wilson. The second factor that aroused suspicion was the analysis of the dust layer. Technical projections on concrete walls and the tops of rusty pipes were covered with a thick, uniform layer of dust that had remained undisturbed for a long time. In rooms where people are constantly present, dust settles unevenly due to air movement and physical contact. Here, the air looked like it had been frozen for years. Only the area immediately around the bed and in the entrance area had freshly stirred dust, indicating recent activity, but it was localized and limited. This completely contradicted the story of the bunker master who brought food daily and had long conversations with his victim. The detectives had the most questions about the condition of the found blue windbreaker. The fabric of the jacket was so damaged by moisture and fungus that it almost disintegrated in the hands of experts. The degree of degradation of the nylon indicated that the item had been in this damp basement for all 4 years without moving or being washed or cared for. If Noah Cooper, as Ethan claimed, had brought and taken things while living a full life on the surface, the clothing could not have turned into such a faded state. It seemed as if the windbreaker had been thrown into this corner back in 2016 and had not been touched since. The story of the monster from the canyon who created the secret underground prison began to crack at the seams under the pressure of physical evidence. While the press filled the airwaves with stories about the genius criminal Noah Cooper, Detective Miller stood in the middle of a dank concrete box. He began to suspect that this room was not a place of long-term imprisonment, but a professionally prepared scene that someone had hastily arranged to give weight to the legend being told. If Noah Cooper was not in this bunker, where was he all these years? And why is there no evidence of his physical presence in the room, except for a rotten jacket thrown into the corner as a decoration? The investigation found itself in a situation where material evidence began to directly contradict the words of the only witness, and the search for the kidnapper was increasingly reminiscent of an attempt to catch up with a ghost that no one had seen except for a person who had just returned from oblivion. The complete absence of Noah Cooper's biological traces in the concrete bunker that for several days was believed to be the scene of his horrific crimes forced Detective Miller to completely reconsider the vector of the investigation. While forensic experts continued to carefully sift through the dust in the technical well, the investigator returned to his office at the Coconino County Sheriff's Department. He couldn't shake the feeling that the whole story he'd heard in the hospital room from Ethan Wilson was a professionally constructed facade, Miller realized. If physical evidence did not confirm Noah's presence as a kidnapper in 2020, he had to look for answers in the time when both boys were still an integral part of their small-town life. Instead of hunting for a ghost in the woods, the detective initiated an in-depth check of the archives, focusing on the events that preceded the disappearance of his friends in August 2016. It was then that an incident surfaced in the archival databases of the State Highway Police that had been almost forgotten in the city, considered an unfortunate accident of the past. On October 12, 2014, at 22 hours and 15 minutes, an accident occurred on the rain-soaked Highway 89. According to police report number 432, a car carrying 16-year-olds Noah Cooper and Ethan Wilson drove at high speed into a ditch and overturned several times. When emergency services arrived, Ethan was driving. Noah, who was sitting in the passenger seat, escaped with only minor scratches and a fright. However, for Ethan, the consequences of that night proved fatal. Detective Miller brought up additional eyewitness accounts from that evening that had previously been considered secondary and disregarded by the court. That day, the local football team, where Ethan was a star athlete and the hope of the entire school, was celebrating a victory. One of the witnesses, a former classmate of the boys named Marcus, said during an informal interview with the detective that Noah Cooper was heavily intoxicated that night. According to Marcus, it was Noah who has always had a strong influence on Ethan, who actively encouraged his friend to drive despite fatigue and difficult weather conditions. The witness recalled a phrase that later took on a completely different meaning. Noah allegedly laughed and assured Ethan that everything will be cool and that a true champion has to take risks. For Ethan Wilson, that risky driving ended up in the hospital medical records from October 13, 2014, showed a complex compression injury to his back and spinal cord damage. This diagnosis became a verdict for his future. A promising athlete, watched by scouts from the country's leading universities and on whom his family's hopes rested, was forced to undergo a painful 9-month rehabilitation. He lost the opportunity to play big-time sports forever, was forced to give up his athletic scholarship and enroll in a modest local college, while his career dreams turned to dust. At the same time, Noah Cooper continued to be a local star, successfully graduating from high school and preparing to enter a prestigious East Coast institution. On August 24, 2020, Detective Miller visited the Cooper home again. This time, he was not interested in the details of the disappearance, but in the emotional background between the boys in the months before the hike. Noah's mother, Carol, sitting in the kitchen nervously clutching a cup of cold coffee, recalled that after the accident in 2014, Ethan had become quieter and more withdrawn. The family considered this a natural reaction to the loss of his sports career and part of his growing up. However, one detail that Carol mentioned almost by accident made Miller shudder inwardly. It turned out that it was Ethan Wilson who suggested the idea of going to the Grand Canyon in August 2016. This seemed extremely strange because, due to chronic back pain after the accident, the boy had never shown interest in hiking before and tried to avoid serious physical activity. Now the version of the tragic accident on a steep canyon slope that had dominated the case file for 4 years looked completely different in the eyes of the investigator. The damaged items, a piece of fabric from his backpack and broken glasses found in 2016, began to seem to Miller not like the consequences of an accidental fall, but part of a premeditated performance. For the first time, the investigation seriously suggested, what if Ethan Wilson came to the canyon on August 23, 2016, not as a best friend, but as a man who had been methodically cultivating a plan of revenge for 2 years? If Ethan had planned the staging of the chain of death, it explained why the bodies were never found in the canyon. They simply could not have been there at the time. Analyzing the new facts, Miller began to realize that the bunker in the forest could only be the final act of this long-running drama. Ethan Wilson, who everyone thought was a victim, suddenly became the center of a theory about large-scale manipulation. But the main question remained: if Noah Cooper was not the jailer, what really happened to him that August day deep in the canyon? And why did Ethan decide to come back now, 4 years later, creating a monster image of the man who was once his closest friend? The investigators began to realize that they were not dealing with a criminal offense in the classical sense, but with a sophisticated act of psychological retribution where every step was calculated to the inch. The detective ordered to once again raise all the search reports from 2016, looking for not traces of a fall, but traces of how someone tried to hide the truth, using the natural landscape as the perfect tool for murder. On August 25, 2020, while Ethan Wilson continued to be monitored at the Flagstaff Clinic, persistently recreating the image of Noah the monster for the detective's cameras, Detective Miller initiated what would later be called a key phase of the investigation. Based on Dr. Harris's medical reports and the strange absence of biological traces in the bunker, the investigation suggested that the events of 4 years ago had been fundamentally misinterpreted. What in 2016 was considered the site of a double fall because of the things found on the edge of the cliff now appeared to the detective only as a professionally executed distraction. Miller was convinced that the real denouement of the drama did not take place in front of the whole world at the precipice, but somewhere in the shadow of the forest, where silence had reliably kept the secret for all these years. A specialized team of forensic experts equipped with portable soil scanners and ground-penetrating radar was brought in to conduct a second, much more detailed survey of the area. This time, Miller ordered a change in focus. Instead of exploring dangerous slopes and steep cliffs again, the team focused on a relatively stable area of woodland located 350 yards inland from the main hiking trail. It was a place where the slopes were not as steep and the dense undergrowth provided natural cover from aerial or trail views. At about 11:30 in the morning, one of the scanners detected a clear density anomaly under a pile of old stones and several fallen pine trunks that had already partially grown into the ground. At first glance, the debris looked like the result of natural erosion, but as the forensic team approached, they noticed one strange detail. The large limestone fragments were laid out too neatly and tightly together, forming an almost flat plain, which is completely uncharacteristic of a chaotic landslide. When officers began to carefully lift the stones, they found an old plastic film under the top layer, and underneath that, what hundreds of volunteers and rangers had been searching for 4 years. In the dry and stable climate of the canyon, the remains were extremely well preserved. It was a skeleton lying in a shallow depression in the soil. Even before formal DNA testing, detectives had no doubt about the identity of the deceased. The remains of the chest showed a clear branded logo of the sports windbreaker that Noah Cooper wore on August 23, 2016. However, the main answers came not from the identification of the person, but from the initial examination of the bones by a forensic anthropologist at the site of the discovery. The first and most important fact was the nature of the mechanical damage. A clear, deep crack with an inward depression was found in the back of the skull. The nature of the fracture clearly indicated that the blow had been inflicted by a heavy, blunt object with enormous force. Unlike injuries from falling from a height, which are usually accompanied by multiple fractures of the limbs and spine, in this case the entire skeleton was intact except for the fatal head injury. This was not an accident or a chain death. It was a precise, calculated, and fatal blow from behind, inflicted on a man who was not expecting an attack. The second piece of evidence that completely refuted Ethan's words was the position of the body. Noah did not fall into the crevice during the struggle or attempted rescue. His remains were carefully placed in a natural depression, and his arms were crossed over his chest. The subsequent disguise of the burial site with stones and tree trunks was so skillfully executed that the body remained invisible even to helicopters with thermal imagers flying over the area in 2016. Whoever did this had enough time, calmness, and coolness to complete his work. The third factor that finally destroyed Ethan's legend was the degree of bone mineralization and the condition of the fabric of his clothes. According to experts, Noah Cooper's death occurred in the first 48 hours after his disappearance in August 2016. This meant that the whole story of 4 years of captivity under the supervision of the living Noah was a cynical and methodical lie. Noah Cooper could not have been a kidnapper or jailer, as he was a dead victim from the very first day of their journey to the canyon. As forensic technicians prepared the remains for transport, Detective Miller stood by the open stone grave, realizing the extent of the deception he had heard in recent days. It became apparent that Ethan Wilson had not only made up the story of his abduction, but had been hiding somewhere for 4 years, probably under an assumed name, patiently waiting for the moment when the memories of the case would fade. All this time, he was preparing his grand finale, the purpose of which was not just to hide his own murder, but to make the whole world believe that the friend he had killed was a monster. The shadow that came out of the woods 4 years later brought with it not the truth, but the last part of a premeditated act of revenge for the accident of 2014. Now the investigation faced a new task: to find irrefutable proof that the rescued Ethan Wilson himself had arranged his false prison, making only one small mistake, which usually becomes fatal for every killer. But for Miller, the main thing was different. Noah Cooper finally spoke through the stones, and his testimony was much more convincing than any story of a living witness. On August 26, 2020, at 14 o'clock sharp in Interrogation Room 3 of the Coconino County Sheriff's Department, an interrogation began that would forever change the course of the investigation into the Canyon Ghost case. Detective Miller entered the room holding a thick folder labeled Evidence Object 8814. Opposite him, under the bright light of fluorescent lamps, sat Ethan Wilson. His appearance remained the same as the day he returned: hunched shoulders, lowered head, and a subtle trembling in his hands, which was supposed to demonstrate deep psychological shock. However, in the surveillance camera that recorded every movement in the room, Ethan's eyes did not look scared, but focused, as if he was calculating the investigator's next move. Miller didn't start with a long introduction. The first thing he placed on the metal table in front of Ethan was a series of high-quality color photographs taken by forensic scientists just a day ago. The images showed the remains found under rocks deep in the Kaibab forest. The detective began to read out the forensic report in a monotone, dry, professional tone. According to protocol number 21 to 46, the degree of bone mineralization and the condition of the blue windbreaker found nearby clearly indicated that Noah Cooper had died in August 2016. The victim's skull showed a 4-inch long fracture caused by a purposeful blow to the back of the head with a heavy object. Miller emphasized that death had occurred instantly 4 years ago, making the whole story of Jailer Noah not just fiction, but a physically impossible event. Ethan listened to this without looking up. For several minutes, a heavy silence reigned in the room, broken only by the hum of the air conditioner. When the detective finished describing Noah's injuries, Ethan tried to return to his usual role. According to the transcript of the interrogation, he whispered that maybe it wasn't Noah, or that someone else was making him believe it was a friend. He continued to mimic despair, covering his face with his hands, but Miller had already prepared the main argument that was to finally destroy this skillfully constructed illusion. The detective took out of a clear plastic evidence bag a plain metal can of canned corn found in the concrete well where Ethan had allegedly spent 4 years in captivity. Miller slowly turned the can around to face Ethan. The bottom of the metal container was stamped with the batch number and date of manufacture. May 2019. The investigator pointed to these numbers with his finger, explaining under the video recording that according to Ethan's official legend, he had been in complete isolation since August 2016, and that was when Noah allegedly locked him in the basement, providing him with supplies. The technical detail was ruthless. This particular product could not have existed in 2016. It was manufactured 3 years after Noah Cooper was already lying dead under a layer of rocks in the forest. It was the moment when the mask Ethan Wilson had worn since his exit from the woods finally cracked. One of the technicians who watched the interrogation through a mirrored glass later noted in a behavioral response report that the transformation was instantaneous and eerie. Ethan suddenly stopped shaking. His hunched posture disappeared, he straightened up in his chair, and his image of a hunted victim was replaced by a cold, contemptuous, and incredibly calculating look. He no longer tried to cry or make excuses. The young man slowly raised his head and looked the detective directly in the eye. For the first time, there was no fear of punishment in that look, only irritation that his perfectly calibrated scheme had failed because of one insignificant can of canned food. Detective Miller continued to press, recalling the vitamin D blood test results and the lack of muscle atrophy mentioned in Dr. Harris's reports. Now that the legend of his captivity had been shattered, the hidden hatred Ethan had harbored for years began to shine through his new, cold manner of communication. According to the officers present in the building, there was a tension in the air of the interrogation room, similar to that of a thunderstorm. Ethan realized that his attempt to not only kill his friend, but to turn him into a national monster, had failed. The motive behind the 2014 accident, which the detective learned about from the archives, has now become the central axis of the investigation. The investigation revealed that Ethan Wilson had stopped imitating the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. He was silent, but it was the silence of a man who does not repent, but analyzes his mistakes. Every detail, from the blue windbreaker thrown into the corner of the bunker as a decoration, to the fresh bruises on his face that he had inflicted on himself before going out to the people, now looked like evidence of a cynical performance. All this time, Ethan was not fighting for his life. He was methodically preparing the stage for his triumphant return, where he was to become a victim, and his dead rival was to become an eternal outcast in people's memories. But the truth, captured at the bottom of the metal can and in the seams of rotting fabric under the stones, was stronger than his artistry. Detective Miller left the interrogation room knowing that he now had enough evidence to file formal charges of premeditated murder. But the main thing that remained to be found out was where Ethan Wilson had been hiding for all those 4 years, while the world believed him to be the dead victim of an accident. Following the formal filing of first-degree murder charges, the investigative team, led by Detective Miller, began an extensive effort to reconstruct the 4 years of Ethan Wilson's life that he tried to erase from the memory of others. Through bank transaction reviews, analysis of CCTV cameras at transportation hubs, and testimony from bystanders, police were able to recreate the killer's path. According to the investigation, 3 days after the massacre of his friend, in August 2016, Ethan left Arizona and moved to Portland, Oregon, where he lived under an assumed name for the next 4 years. In Portland, Ethan settled in an industrial area, renting a tiny room in a hostel for seasonal workers. He worked low-paying jobs, as a loader at scrap metal warehouses and as a cleaner in night laundries. His former colleagues remembered him as a shadow man who never talked about the past and avoided any joint activities. All this time, Ethan methodically cultivated a plan for his return. As forensic psychologists found, it was not enough for him to simply kill Noah for the sports career he lost in the accident in 2014. He wanted to completely erase his friend's good name, turning the victim into a national monster and himself into an eternal victim. Preparations for the final act of this drama lasted almost 6 months. Ethan deliberately restricted himself from eating to reach a state of physical exhaustion. According to Portland Library records, he repeatedly borrowed books on psychiatry, studying the symptoms of deep psychological trauma and the behavior of people after prolonged isolation. A few weeks before his exit, he secretly returned to the canyon, set up an old concrete well with Noah's belongings and his own food supplies, making a fatal mistake with the production date on the cans. His goal was to wait in the woods for a few days, inflict minor injuries on himself, and come out to the people as a man who had escaped from hell. The trial in Arizona, which took place in 2021, was a high-profile end to the case. Despite the defense's attempts to attribute Ethan's actions to post-traumatic stress disorder after the accident in 2014, the jury found him guilty of first-degree premeditated murder. In his closing remarks, the judge emphasized the particular cruelty of not only the crime itself, but also the subsequent 4-year manipulation of the Cooper family's feelings. Ethan Wilson was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of early release. Noah Cooper was reburied at the city cemetery, cleared of all unjust charges. For the city's residents, this story remains a grim reminder that a grudge nurtured over the years can become more dangerous than any Grand Canyon chasm. An empty car in a parking lot, broken glasses on the slope, and insidious lies during interrogations finally formed a single picture of a tragedy in which one young man lost his life and another lost his soul. The truth hidden among the red rocks finally came to light, leaving only the bitter taste of revenge that never brought the killer the peace he desired.